This week's grammar lesson is about complex compound sentences. A complex sentence contains one independent clause, which is a complete idea or a complete sentence, and one or more dependent clauses, which are incomplete ideas. They contain subordinate conjunctions, which just means secondary. And when you add a subordinating conjunction, which is a word such as after, because, although, or when, to a clause, you automatically make it a dependent clause. Therefore, subordinating conjunctions introduce secondary ideas that cannot stand on their own. Here is a list of subordinating conjunctions. Even if you have a complete thought, if you put one of these words in front of that thought, you make that thought incomplete because it needs to be linked to another independent clause in order for that dependent clause to make sense. So how do you punctuate them? If you use a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the sentence, you put a comma after the dependent clause. So for example, in here, since Julie wants to make an A, she studies diligently. Since is a subordinating conjunction, so that makes Julie wants to make an A dependent clause. So it needs another independent clause after it. So since Julie wants to make an A, comma, she studies diligently. Usually, if the subordinating conjunction is in the middle of the sentence, you do not need to use a comma. For example, Julie studies diligently because she wants to make an A. Because is also a subordinating conjunction, but you do not need a comma before it because it's all of one thought. So, relative pronouns in punctuation. Words like which, that, and who are called relative pronouns, and they have very specific ways in which they should be punctuated. When you have a phrase that begins with which and you surround it by commas, then it means you can take that out completely without losing the point of the sentence. So for example, the lecture, which was very boring, ran over time. The point of this sentence is that the lecture ran over time. The fact that it was boring is secondary information. So you could take that whole phrase out right there, or clause, excuse me, and the sentence will still make sense. The lecture ran over time. But the word that does not work that way. For example, on the day that we had to take our final, I got sick. If you take out the that clause, that we had to take our final, you are left with a sentence that reads, on the day I got sick, which is an incomplete thought. So that has to that phrase, the clause with that in it, has to stay in there for that sentence to make sense. Now, who is a little bit more confusing because sometimes you need a comma and sometimes you don't. The rule is that if you put commas around it, that means you can take that clause out without it losing the point of the sentence. When you have a clause that begins with who, the same rules apply as with that and which. If it is a phrase that can be taken out of the sentence without the sentence losing its meaning, then you do not need the commas. However, if it is something that is essential to the importance of the sentence and to understanding of the sentence, then you must leave it in. So for example, the two young men who started the riot were arrested. Okay, the two young men were arrested. The who phrase in there, who started the riot, is not essential to understanding that two men were arrested. It gives you a reason why. In the second example, my friend Jessica, who used to work at Burger King, is attending Sci-Fair College with me. In that case, who used to work at Burger King is essential, or you're defining which Jessica if there's more than one. Now I want you to create 5 sentences using 5 different subordinating conjunctions from the subordinating conjunctions slide. A compound complex sentence. You can combine a compound sentence, which we talked about last week, with a complex sentence, and it makes a really long, elaborate sentence. So for example, since Julie wants to make an A in this class, she works diligently at home and she goes to tutorials frequently. This is an example of a compound complex sentence. It has one dependent clause, which is since Julie wants to make an A in this class, and it has 2 independent clauses joined by a fanboys. They are she works diligently at home And the second one is she goes to the tutorials frequently. Both those independent clauses can stand on themselves. So you have a dependent plus an independent clause plus an independent clause. When you create compound complex sentences, you need to be careful. The longer your sentence is, when creating compound complex sentences, you need to be careful because the longer your sentence is, the higher your risk is of making errors and accidentally punctuating it incorrectly.